All right. Is this one working? Yeah. Thanks so much for having me. It's really wonderful to be here. It's been a fascinating conference. My talk's probably going to be slightly off the addiction topic. We're going to back out a little bit and talk about social context and talk about poverty and then sort of biological mechanisms involved in the immune system that I think have a lot of relevance for addiction and for other kinds of mental health problems, but we're not squarely on that. So feel free to ask questions about implications or anything you want. I'm going to go ahead and get started. This is all work that I've done collaboratively with Edith, who's going to talk next, and a number of other excellent collaborators in different disciplines that I'll acknowledge later on. So we're interested in kids who grow up in economically difficult situations and understanding what sorts of risk those conditions pose for their health across the lifespan and how we can change policies and develop practices that mitigate those risks. So let's see. So this is, I think, a helpful slide looking at rates of childhood poverty in countries that are described as wealthy or having advanced economies. And you can see that each column represents a country and there's a vertical arrow. And the top of the arrow tells you what the poverty rate is in that country on average if you just consider household income. And then the bottom of the arrow tells you what the poverty rate is if you take into account government transfers, so policies that governments may use to help families with food, with housing, with health care. And one thing's really striking, or two things are really striking. So this is the United States right here, and actually Israel happens to be right next to it. You can see that when you don't take into account government transfers, both countries have a poverty rate on this measure somewhere approaching 30%. The U.S. doesn't have especially generous transfers to families by anybody's standards, certainly not by the standards of Western European nations. Israel does not either. So these are both countries where child poverty is frequent, and at least in terms of governmental economic transfers, there's not a lot being done to mitigate it by resources in terms of food, housing, education, things like that. So it's a common exposure for children, maybe somewhere between 20 and 30%. And social scientists have spent a long time in North America and other parts of the world documenting what growing up in economically difficult circumstances does to kids' life chances. And there has been decades and decades of research focusing and showing on the differences in school performance between kids who have more and fewer resources at home, the implications for their labor market success. So do they graduate from university? What kinds of jobs do they go on to? Do they tend to have stable employment? Their likelihood of having interactions with the criminal justice system, and some in terms of mental health too. And in almost all of these domains, it's pretty clear, particularly in North America, that kids who grow up with fewer financial advantages have worse outcomes across these domains. What's become, I think, more surprising and more evident over the past couple of decades is that the risks associated with growing up poor or in economic hardship are much broader and much more durable across time than I think anyone had previously anticipated based on the social sciences literature. So this is a set of figures from a paper out of the Dunedin cohort. So this is a birth cohort developed by Richie Poulton, Avshalom Caspi, and Temi Moffat have been involved in this study. And what you're looking at here is about 10 different physical and mental health outcomes at age 26 as a function of the participants' socioeconomic trajectories across their life course. So was their family high or low in socioeconomic status when they were kids? And then how would you rate them when they're in their mid-20s? And most of them have developed their own socioeconomic status based on their education and income. And what you see across these various measures of physical health, so adiposity, blood pressure, cardiorespiratory fitness, dental health, and then down here you have depression, alcohol dependence, and tobacco dependence, is these strong main effects of early life financial situation that almost don't get moved around a lot by what happens. So if you grow up in a family that doesn't have a lot of resources, educationally or materially, when you're in your mid-20s, you look worse in terms of adiposity and blood pressure, your dental health is worse, and your likelihood of having alcohol and tobacco dependence and depression is higher. Changed a little bit if you yourself did well, but not materially much. So you might say, okay, these are the mid-20s, Maybe people really haven't had a chance to grow into their own, achieve social status, their educational attainment, their income hasn't started paying dividends yet. But we know from dozens and dozens of other studies using dozens and dozens of different approaches that these patterns are also seen when we look later in the life course. We take a broader look at health outcomes and we use a variety of research designs. So there are studies linking early life financial conditions to your life expectancy, so how long you live, to your likelihood of having an early heart attack or an early stroke, to some forms of cancer, to major DSM categories of mental illness. And you see these findings, interestingly, across a variety of approaches that social scientists and physicians and epidemiologists use. So you see it in classic epidemiological studies like the Deneen one, but you also see it in studies that use natural experimental design. So this is a great set of studies led by Jane Costello that looked at what happened to kids who grew up on tribal lands in the United States when a casino went in and their families started receiving cash revenues from the casinos. And you saw over time big reductions in the incidence of mental health problems and addiction in kids whose families had those income supplements. You've also have studies that have looked in Europe at people born in at different phases of business cycles. So were you born in a year when things were booming or busting, and then looked down the line 20, 30, 40 years later to see what people's likelihood of having early heart disease and stroke were. And then you have genetic studies trying to look at twins born to mothers who were higher or lower in social status, and then adopted into families who had higher or lower social status. So you can start to take apart genetic versus contextual contributions. And all those different types of designs converge on the same conclusion that what happens in early life has implications for physical and mental health later in life. It's not totally deterministic. It doesn't explain all the variants, but there is a reliable association. And when people hear about these findings, they have three quick intuitions about what's going on. So let's talk about those. The first intuition is that these really aren't causal effects of early life experience on later health, but instead they're just confounded by underlying genetics. And the argument goes something like this. There is a set of risk genes that travel in families that predispose people to both lousy sort of human capital outcomes, they don't do well in school, they don't make a lot of money, and to lousy health outcomes. They're more likely to have heart attacks, have substance use problems. So this is a hard one to evaluate definitively in human studies because the people who postulate this genetic mechanism usually can't point to specific variants or even set of variants that might pose such broad risks. But when you do natural experiments like the casino study I told you about, or the twins raised in discordant or concordant environments, you see findings that suggest environmental as well as genetic contributions to these outcomes. So there's no evidence from those studies that this is purely accounted for by genetics. Maybe partly, but probably not mostly. People often think about differential access to health care as a strong correlate of socioeconomic status. This is particularly true in the United States, less so in other places. But you see these same relationships in Western European countries that have much more universal access to care. Edith and I lived in Canada for a decade, which is very close to the United States geographically, but very different in terms of health policy. You see the same patterns in Canada where healthcare as an issue is taken off the table. So it doesn't seem to be about just simply having access to healthcare. And then the other explanation that comes to mind if you're a lifespan person is that this isn't really so much about what happens in childhood, but it's about what happens the rest of the life course. And the idea here is that there isn't in contemporary societies, particularly in the United States, but also in other countries, as much socioeconomic mobility in the upward direction as there used to be. It is harder today, particularly in America, if you grow up poor or if you grow up in a family without a lot of education, to become wealthy, to achieve a lot of higher education. We have pulled up the ladders, and so some people see these findings and say, this isn't really telling us about what happens in childhood, it's just telling us about what happens as people move into adulthood. There are lots of studies that show that this isn't true. For example, you can look at people who graduate from prestigious medical schools in the United States, and have very high socioeconomic status because of that, in terms of their education, in terms of their occupational prestige, in terms of their income. And their health over the long term, even though they're sort of at the pinnacle of what Americans would consider high status, correlates quite strongly with their childhood circumstances. So it doesn't seem to just be about what's happening in adulthood. There really is something about childhood and adolescence being a sensitive period for exposure to financial hardship and other kinds of adversities, and what happens across the rest of the life course in terms of particularly physical health, but also mental health. And so our work has been, over the past decade, trying to understand how you might be able to explain connections between what happens in the first 10 or 15 years of life and then what happens over the next 40 or 50, how you might get those connections over time and how you might get them mechanistically. And our focus has been heavily on the role of the immune system as a potential mediator. And we've been particularly focused on this idea of non-resolving or low-grade inflammation, which, as many of you probably know, is connected to the pathogenesis of most chronic diseases that account for the great majority of suffering and disability and mortality in advanced nations. This is a slide from about 15 years ago. And you'll notice there isn't anything up here on neurodegenerative disease, there isn't anything up here on mental health, there isn't anything up here on addiction. Those all would belong up here on a more updated graph because we know that low-grade inflammation from both animal models and from human studies plays a role and contributes to those conditions as well. So we think that it's possibly a common risk pathway that could explain some of the connections between early hardship and later health problems, and that's why we focus there. You might say, okay, so how do you get from something like early economic hardship, your parents don't have a lot of resources, to inflammation, to where the cells of your innate immune system have sustained activation? How do you get from context into mind and down to the lymph nodes or the spleen or wherever you're thinking about the immune system acting? The answer to that is that in many nations, especially the United States, kids who grow up in terms of economic hardship are disproportionately exposed to what we call social and physical pollutants. Not every child who grows up poor has all of these exposures, but on average, kids who are disadvantaged are more likely to experience stigma about their family's economic conditions, forms of mistreatment, which can include racial discrimination, low levels of opportunity, higher levels of family conflict and neighborhood violence are also reliable correlates of economic disadvantage. On the physical side, air pollution and indoor toxins and environmental tobacco smoke distribute spatially along socioeconomic lines. So to say that more simply, at least in the United States, factories that belch out smoke and pollutants aren't placed at random. They're not placed in wealthy neighborhoods. They're selectively placed in neighborhoods where people don't have the ability to push back. And so kids who grow up poor are much more likely to be exposed to things that are emitted by those factories. We know from lots and lots of work in both humans and animals that both these social and physical pollutants can selectively mobilize a class of immune cells called monocytes out of the bone marrow and into circulation. And the cells that get pushed out by these social and physical pollutants tend to be these really immature monocytes that have just been hatched that are really pro-inflammatory. And so these cells come out of bone marrow and they're primed, they're ready to go, they move through the circulation and they're ready to move in to tissue spaces where there's been an infection and injury and have a stronger response than they would otherwise. So this is part, likely, of the fight or flight response that has been not historically recognized. People think about the heart, they think about the lungs, they don't think about the immune system very much with fight or flight, but it seems that this egress of highly inflammatory cells goes along with all the classic other sympathetically mediated fight or flight responses. And so about a decade and a half ago, we proposed a model explaining that kids who grow up in financially difficult circumstances have what we call the pro-inflammatory phenotype, And this is characterized by a tendency of those monocytes and the cells that they mature into, dendritic cells and macrophages, to have more aggressive responses to both microbial stimuli that they might encounter, so bacteria and viruses being the common ones, but also there are a lot of sterile stimuli that activate immune cells. It doesn't necessarily take a pathogen. There are a lot of, for example, environmental pollutants that can activate monocytes to become pro-inflammatory, trans fats, other things can. And our hypothesis is that early adversity is going to make these cells more responsive. At the same time, those cells aren't going to be as sensitive to things that slow down the inflammatory response. So you've got both internal signals from the immune system, like interleukin 10, and you've got other hormones like glucocorticoids that normally slow down the inflammatory response. And we hypothesize that early financial hardship is going to make those anti-inflammatory signals less successful. And then as a result of sort of those tendencies in immune cells, kids who grow up in difficult circumstances are going to have this low-grade, ongoing, non-resolving inflammation that's implicated in so many life course diseases. So here's a paper where we tested this hypothesis led by a graduate student several years ago. And what we did in this paper is test this idea that economic hardship, acting in this study primarily through psychological stressors, is going to promote this pro-inflammatory phenotype. And we did this by pulling together 6 different studies we'd done over a couple of decades in Canada and the US that covered a good part of the life course with about 1,600 participants. A couple of them were cross-sectional, most were longitudinal with repeated follow-ups. And what we did is harmonize measures across these 2 decades worth of studies. So we had an economic hardship indicator that included household education and income and savings. We assessed psychological stress in each of the studies through structured interviews where trained raters went through and evaluated the level of strain in kids and adults' relationships in school settings and workplaces. And then we did a lot of in vitro studies to characterize this pro-inflammatory phenotype and use something called latent profile analysis to group people into higher or lower levels of this pro-inflammatory phenotype. Let me tell you quickly about these in vitro studies. So in the first set of in vitro studies, what we're doing is we're collecting peripheral blood and we're exposing the monocytes in that blood to various stimuli. And then we're culturing the cells for 6 hours in an incubator, and we're measuring the production of cytokines. These are cellular messengers that orchestrate the inflammatory response. Tell cells to divide, get them activated, tell them to differentiate. And we stimulate cells with a variety of different sterile and microbial triggers that make them think they need to respond. So some of these are bacterial, some are viral, some are sterile. And then we do other experiments where we co-culture these monocytes with bacterial stimuli, and we add hydrocortisone in, which is going to suppress this inflammatory response. And we're testing the hypothesis that depending on your level of stress or economic hardship, hydrocortisone is going to be more or less successful at reducing the extent of your inflammatory response in vitro. So the main findings are here. This is quick. So we've got 3 different kinds of analyses in this paper. One is cross-sectional analyses where we're linking socioeconomic disadvantage to this pro-inflammatory phenotype, all measured at the same time. We've got prospective analyses where we're looking at whether socioeconomic disadvantage tells us something in the future about pro-inflammatory phenotype. And then we've got the true prospective analysis where we're saying, in these studies, does your pro-inflammatory phenotype status change from the first time we see you to 2 or 3 years later when we see you again? And does your socioeconomic conditions forecast whether you're going to change? And in all 3 of these analyses, we see the same thing, that people who are experiencing more economic hardship are more likely to have this pro-inflammatory phenotype, so their cells respond with more cytokines to sterile and microbial stimuli. The anti-inflammatory agents are less successful at reducing that response. And we even see that in the most conservative prospective change analysis. And for the most part, it goes through higher levels of chronic psychological stress. So this is typically stress that people are having in their relationships and in their workplaces or their school settings. So that is kind of part one of the talk, this link between socioeconomic disadvantage, life stress, and the responsivity of these particular immune cells that are involved in orchestrating and sustaining inflammation. Maybe a little bit more relevant to this crowd is work we've done over the past decade trying to understand the brain's role in these associations. And we've been interested in kind of two circuits that psychologists has emphasized in this literature as being related to early hardship. So one is the corticoamygdala threat circuitry that involves regions like the amygdala and the insula and the VMPFC. And these regions support both threat vigilance, so looking out for danger that you anticipate may be in the environment, and also threat reactivity, so responding to that danger when and if it does arrive. And we know from lots of behavioral literature that kids who grow up in economically difficult circumstances show more vigilance for threat and greater reactivity to threat. And you can see that behaviorally, you can see that with psychophysiology, you can see that also with neuroimaging. You might say, okay, what does this have to do with the immune cells you're talking about? It turns out that one of the key drivers of pushing those myeloid cells, those monocytes, out of the bone marrow is sympathetic activation. There are sympathetic fibers that descend straight from the brain into bone marrow, into lymph nodes, into the spleen, and adrenergic signals cause those cells to detach from their bone marrow niche and go into circulation. So when you activate those sympathetic fibers through threat responsivity, you're going to presumably get this same sort of efflux of these highly inflammatory cells I've been talking about. In fact, you can give people beta blockers and you can, in doing so, you can abrogate that immune response to threat. We're also interested in reward circuitry, so we've heard a lot about that today, and I'm sure we'll hear more. So these are circuits that involve regions like the OFC, the nucleus accumbens, and the striatum more generally. We know from, again, lots of behavioral literature that kids who grow up in economically difficult circumstances show behaviorally and show on neuroimaging studies higher indications of reward sensitivity. So if you want to think about it in the way Kent Barrett might have proposed with wanting and liking, what you see is that hardship seems to sensitize low-income kids so that they show more pursuit of highly pleasurable stimuli, particularly around food and to some extent around substances too, although I don't think that's been studied quite as well. And what we know immunologically is that high-fat diets, cigarette smoking, some drugs of abuse, and certainly physical activity all can cause that same mobilization of the immune cells I'm talking about. So there's a clear behavioral pathway from reward circuitries down to the immune system. And our work, last point, is that this goes both directions, right? I've been talking brain to immune cells, but we know from lots of work that, say, Andy Miller's group has done at Emory, Razir Mia has done some of this great work here in Jerusalem, showing that the mediators of this inflammatory response, these cytokines, can access the brain, and in doing so, they can change people's, they can change both the threat and the reward circuits that I've been talking about, and this is probably the basis for some of the clear connections between inflammatory activity, mood disorders, and some anxiety disorders. So we have to think about this as going both from brain to immune and immune back to brain. And our work has really focused on this idea that what early hardship might do is set up this feedback loop between the threat circuits and the reward circuits and inflammatory activity and kick it into a gear in a way that it just keeps going and is sustained over time. And we've started to test this hypothesis using neuroimaging studies. So I'm going to show you data from a couple of hundred kids that we've evaluated in Chicago. They're all in 8th grade, In Chicago, that means their ages range from about 12 to 14. This is a very diverse sample, racially, ethnically, and economically. We're going to measure inflammation by drawing fasting blood and quantifying 5 circulating biomarkers, C-reactive protein, interleukin-6, etc. I can give more details later. And then we're going to put kids in the scanner and look at the bold response in 2 different tasks, one assessing threat and one assessing reward. So here is the threat task. Our pre-specified ROI was the amygdala bilaterally, and this is just a simple amygdala response to an angry face. I got 5 minutes. And what we see here, interestingly, is that if you look at kids whose family income puts them below the poverty threshold, you see a strong correlation between their amygdala activity, reactivity to the angry face, and their level of inflammation. These 2 things co-vary positively. So in these kids, the more inflammation is happening, the higher the amygdala reactivity. So these things couple, they stay together, consistent with this idea that the brain and the immune system are potentially in this communication loop. But as family economic circumstances improve, that coupling goes away, right? In kids who are in higher income or middle income families, there's no association whatsoever. And we see the same thing with this reward task. So this is a task where, again, pre-specified ROI is ventral striatum, and this is a task where kids can earn money for performing well. And we see this same pattern where in kids whose families have low income, below the poverty threshold, there's this positive association. The greater the reward responsivity, the more inflammation is going on. But that association breaks down as family economic circumstances improve. So again, these are preliminary findings suggesting that, especially for the most vulnerable at-risk kids economically, the brain measures and the immune measures couple, and they couple fairly tightly, but that doesn't happen in older kids, consistent with the idea that there's potentially a feedback loop. We've got further studies evaluating that in more rigorous longitudinal designs. One thing that we're in the middle of launching right now, is a big randomized trial to try to test these hypotheses in a way that is both more rigorous in terms of giving us causal answers and more rigorous in terms of giving us policy insights. So there's a big study that was done in the US funded by Sam Altman that randomized 1,000 families in Chicago to either receive $1,000 a month for 3 years or $50 a month for 3 years, unconditional cash transfer. They get the money regardless. And so we're following up these families and the kids in particular to look at mental health and brain development and inflammatory activity to ask this question of whether income really does change things in the way our hypotheses presuppose. One quick other thing I want to talk about. I have talked entirely for my 20 minutes about risk. And what I haven't talked about is the second part of our symposium, which is resilience. And of course, it's important, hugely important to emphasize that not every kid who grows up in economically challenging circumstances goes on to have health problems. In fact, many of them don't, and it's just as important to understand resilience and pathways to it as it is to understand mechanisms to risk and disorder. And we have written pretty extensively about the kinds of things that Abby was discussing with regard to physical health. So this idea that by changing the interactions that at-risk kids have with their peers and with their families, that you can promote cascading changes. And our focus has more been on cardiovascular health and immune health and asthma. There's a long history in prevention science and developmental psychopathology of showing this with mental health outcomes and academic outcomes. And I think our most interesting work on this is an intervention study we did with a colleague named Jean Brody, who enrolled a large cohort of 11-year-old kids and their caregivers who were living in small towns in a very rural area of the southeast part of the United States. These are all Black families who are almost universally low income or poor by any definition. who are living in towns of 5 to 10,000 people, so small, rural, black families who haven't received much in the way of resources or support from their local or state or federal governments. And they participated in an intervention that sounds a lot like what Abby described. The focus was on improving communication and family relationships as these 11-year-olds moved into adolescence, helping parents understand how to be vigilant and monitor their kids as they moved into adolescence, and how those parents could intervene and have discussions in a way that was supportive and reduce risk and not harsh and critical. And just to give you the punchline, we got involved in this study 8 years after the intervention was done, when the kids were 19, and we went out into these small towns in Georgia and drew blood to measure inflammation. And we saw this very stunning difference. These are the kids who participated in the intervention at age 11. It's called Strong African American Families. These are the kids who are randomized to the control group. And on the y-axis, you have a composite of 6 different biomarkers of inflammation. And you can see that these differences, you don't even need a t-test to know that they're reliable in the direction that you'd suppose. And when you do the sort of latent, oh, I lost that slide. There it is. You do the latent difference score model, asking, is it changes in parenting that explains the differences in inflammation? It absolutely is. It's not the only thing, but a lot of the difference between the group who got the intervention and the group who didn't is explained by changes in parenting from pre to post intervention. And it's a combination of both more engaged and nurturing parenting, so being there for your kids, interacting with them, and less harsh, inconsistent parenting. So to get the reductions in inflammation, you couldn't just change in one way, you had to change in both. And that's my bell. All right.
That wasn't intentional, by the way.
It worked. That's good.
Perfect timing. Okay. We have time for a question. And then the applause. John?
I'm just wondering about the cause and effect.
Yeah.
Do children growing up in difficult situations, they're exposed like to an environment that induces immunology, and that somehow, I don't know, causes their changes in their behavior, or maybe they have like a more active reward system, and that somehow activates also the immune system.
This is a great question. Where does it start and where does it end?
Yeah.
So I think it's becoming increasingly clear that these systems really do communicate, and not just in pathology, right? Under physiological conditions. And so you could imagine scenarios where you could enter a loop like that at any point because of excessive activity in threat circuits or reward circuits, or because you get some kind of chronic infection that activates the immune system, and that in turn changes the brain. And so it could start with environment, it could start with the brain, it could start with the immune, but I think that once you're in the loop, it's hard to get out. And I think that the big kind of cash transfer intervention that we're doing, and some of these parenting interventions that we're also doing, the real hypothesis for us to test is, can we break the loop? And so in all of these studies, we're simultaneously doing measures of context and family interactions and brain and immune over time to see if we can answer that question.
But your hypothesis is that the environment, the hardship, that they create the loopholes.
Yeah, we think that hardship is the first thing. Early in life, we think hardship is what does it. Yeah?
So just following on from Yoni's question, so the Barker hypothesis, the fetal origin, are you familiar with that? So
Yeah.
the nutrient environment, the maternal nutrition, and the impact on perhaps epigenetics, how does that, have there been studies that look into that individually compared to childhood hardships to see which are contributing individually?
Yeah, so good points. Barker hypothesis, epigenetics, a lot there. I guess I would say quickly, I think Barker's idea that there is a sensitive period in utero was an amazing observation. I think it's been refined over time to think about other sensitive periods. I think that, in today's world, people would say that the strict version of the Barker's hypothesis probably doesn't apply to the immune system. That there might be more or less sensitive periods, but plasticity stays in the system, right? You wouldn't want to shut your immune system off to learning about external threats for the entire life course. But the idea that you could have some in utero or postnatal sort of sensitive periods still holds. We've done a lot of work on DNA methylation and other epigenetic mechanisms. While I think the brain findings are fairly compelling in lots of models, it doesn't work so well in immune cells. So the variability in methylation patterns and chromatin architecture in monocytes, the cells that we study, isn't that significant. So we spent millions of dollars on Illumina chips to find that out over years, but that's kind of how the research goes. So I wouldn't put my money there if I was interested in inflammation. Any more money? How's that?
Thank you very much.